I'm Mark Bowinkle. People call me Pastor Potter. I'm a retired United Methodist pastor and a part-time potter, and this is my garage studio in Monterey, California. Here in the middle of the coronavirus shelter in place, I was inspired today by a comment from a colleague online about centering. At a time like this, for us to be centered and take the time to be centered in a world full of anxiety and fear and anticipation of what's next. And so I thought about that wonderful word that we often use psychologically about being centered, and my own craft with ceramics. That's why they call it throwing a pot. Centering as a metaphor for that process of focus and grounding has been used throughout the years by many. Certainly it's alluded to in the Bible, in the prophet Jeremiah. Omer Khayyam mentions it in the Rubaiyat, and in many cultures and in languages, references to the ceramic arts and centering reminds us of the poetry, of the metaphor of the potter that takes a mass of clay, which when thrown on the wheel is chaotic and unruly, out of order. Nothing can be made out of it. And with the motion of the wheel and the strength of hands can bring the mass of the clay into an equal motion and movement in rhythm and balance with the motion of the clay and the torque of the wheel, and bring order out of chaos. Nothing out of ceramics made on the wheel can be done unless one is centered. And there's definitely a connection psychologically and emotionally for the potter to the centering moment. If I'm out of sorts and my mind is elsewhere, it's very, very hard to center the clay. And although some strength is applied, it really is a matter of being still in oneself, holding one's hands still, to allow the clay to move within the mold that you're forming with your hands, and yield to that space that you're creating with your hands, along with the motion of the wheel. And once the clay is centered, creativity is possible with clay on a wheel. If it's not centered, it's just chaos. And many a philosopher have suggested that's true of life. If you're a baby boomer, you may have remembered Mary Richardson's great book, Centering: Poetry, Pottery, and Person, first published in 1963. A classic piece written at that time by a poet and a potter. Mary Richardson spent most of her teaching career at Black Mountain College. And in the summer of 1953, this very avant-garde school welcomed potters to teach including Dan Rhodes and Peter Volkos, very, very famous UC Berkeley potters and pioneers in post-World War II ceramic arts and postmodernism, expressionism in ceramic arts. And Mary, along with her poetry, became a potter at the time. Well, she wrote the classic book on centering that it's now in the second edition and is still considered a masterpiece by many, many potters. Throughout the throwing process, it's all too easy to knock a form out of centering. One of the things I've loved about the craft is if one has centered the piece at the very beginning of the interaction with the clay on the wheel, and in the process it gets knocked out of center with a wobble just when everything looks like it's going to fall apart. Still possible to recenter the piece if it has been centered to begin with, such as and I think that's a great metaphor for life. It doesn't always offer us a lot of second chances. But if you have begun your life, or if you found center somewhere along the way, it's always possible to get back to it. Like the clay allows its memory of centeredness so our lives will return to center if and when we let it. One of the things I've also learned about centering is if you recenter a pot after it's been knocked out, the mistake or the variance in the clay body will come out in an uneven lip, which can then, at the right time, be cut away. It's also true of life too, isn't it? Sometimes we need to prune, discard, and leave behind in order to be completely healed. When we think of centering in the person, in the personality, we think of the term now commonly referred to as mindfulness, a Buddhist or a psychological term that describes us being still and centered. Balanced. Another favorite term, grounded. I've noticed over the years of pottery making, and certainly true of other colleagues in the craft, when I pull a cylinder like this, I can actually feel my connection to the earth. In fact, it goes best when, especially while standing, I can feel my feet grounded and connected with the earth as I pull up and shape out the piece. And sometimes things don't work out the way you expect. That's the wonderful lesson in the poetry of the prophet Jeremiah in the 18th chapter of the prophet in the Hebrew Scriptures, where the pot is spoiled as the prophet comes to watch the potter in the potter's house. Yet the potter is able to take the clay, it having been centered originally, and still make something useful out of it. The prophet alludes that this is how God will deal with Israel at a time of great fear and consternation in the nation. They are about to be invaded by hostile armies in the north. Jeremiah is looking for hope in a time of great fear, destruction of Jerusalem, the exile of the intelligentsia of Israel will result, as indeed Nebuchadnezzar comes and takes his mighty forces and destroys the nation of Israel at that time, sacking the city, burning the temple to the ground. That's all in 586 BCE. There will be a test at the end of this. But there at that moment, Jeremiah, watching the potter, taking a spoiled piece of clay and turning it into something beautiful, finds a metaphor for hope at a time of great fear. And although the war with Babylon will indeed bring ruin and destruction, terrible suffering, about 70 years later, Israel will return to rebuild their nation. They will return to rebuild Jerusalem and its temple. And in a new time and a new place, be restored. If you will, it will be recentered again, returning to that hope and promise that it had known in the beginning. Of course, we hope that anyone going through a time of failure and suffering will find a resolution to that very quickly, not 70 years. But the point being is, once being centered, even if destruction comes, failure and brokenness comes, there's still a possibility of rebirth and recreation as one returns to the center. That's certainly our hope, isn't it, in a time like this, that we could find that purpose, that trust in the future at a time of great suffering for so many. Our colleague is right. My colleague was right this morning. It is a time for us to be centered and to seek it again. Grace and peace to you and yours.